The Middle East remains a region of enduring volatility and shifting alliances. And in Trump's second term, US policy once again confronts the complexities of balancing hard power, diplomacy, and domestic priorities. From the crisis in Gaza and heightened tensions with Iran to the uncertain post war trajectory of Syria, the administration faces difficult choices that will reverberate across the region. This panel will aim to explore how Trump's approach, characterized by assertive strikes, realignment with key allies, and skepticism towards multilateral diplomacy, might shape the Middle East's next phase. It will examine prospects for de escalation, the future of US influence, and the humanitarian and geopolitical challenges that define this pivotal moment. Moderating our second panel today, we are fortunate to have Dr. James Ryan. Dr. Ryan is the Executive Director of the Middle East Research and Information Project and the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association, as well as being an adjunct professor of history and international studies at Rowan University. He is a historian focusing on the history and politics of the Ottoman Empire and Turkey in the 20th and 21st centuries, and is currently working on a book project investigating interwar dissent and opposition in Turkey. As with the previous panel, there'll be time for questions from the audience, so please do use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens if you'd like to ask questions. But otherwise, I shall hand over to James.
Thank you so much, Charlie. It's great to be back with RSAA and with a really fantastic group of panelists to talk about U.S. policy in the Middle East and the Trump 2 administration so far. I think what I'll do is I'll introduce all of the speakers right off the top in the order that they're going to go in the first round, and then we'll dive in. So we're joined today by Mohammed Saleh, who is a non-resident senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute's National Security Program and a researcher and journalist based in the U.S. For over 2 decades, Saleh has written extensively on Middle Eastern affairs for leading regional and international media outlets, think tanks, and academic journals. And his work centers on Kurdish affairs, Iraq, Iran, Syria, the Islamic State, and regional geopolitical struggles. Next, we'll have Stephen Cook, who is the Eni Enrico Mattei Senior Fellow for the Middle East and Africa Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. He is an expert on Arab and Turkish politics, as well as U.S. Middle East policy. Cook is the author of a recently published book, The End of Ambition. We've got the cover in the background there. Yeah, you can point it out there. America's Past, Present, and Future in the Middle East, which was released last year from Oxford University Press. He is also a columnist for Foreign Policy magazine. And lastly, we have Dr. Sanam Vakil, who is the director of the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House, where she directs a diverse portfolio of research and policy initiatives addressing critical issues across the region. In addition to her policy work, she holds the James Anderson Professorial Lectureship in Middle East Studies at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Bologna, Italy, where she teaches Middle East politics. I want to welcome each of you here to be here to this fantastic panel, and it's really a pleasure to be with all of you. So to start us off here, I mean, over the last year, we've witnessed some very dramatic developments in the region. I'd say some of which reflect deepening of longstanding crises, with the Palestinian-Israeli issue most prominently, but the waves radiate out from there across the Gulf to Iran and beyond, and some that were entirely unexpected, namely the stunning success of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in toppling Bashar al-Assad in Syria in December of last year, representing the final end of more than 50 years of Ba'athist rule in the Middle East. All of this has posed a set of challenges to the Trump administration that I think are quite a bit more complicated than any he faced in his first administration. So to start, Mohammed, I'm going to turn to you. You've studied and written extensively about the Syrian civil war and the unfolding revolution, which is still in a very tenuous period. How would you characterize the Trump administration's approach to this newer problem, let's say?
Thank you so much for having me, Jim, and thanks to RSAA. It's great to be part of this important conversation about the region and to share the panel with such distinguished colleagues. Let me start with a simple but central point about why Syria matters today to the United States. After decades of hostile and uncooperative regimes and more than 20 years of Syria functioning as a breeding and transit ground for jihadi activity, going back, of course, all the way back to 2003, Washington now sees an opportunity to build a friendly and a strategic relationship with the new government and regime in Damascus. We have to keep in mind, of course, that engagement wasn't the position of the current Trump administration from the beginning, but following Trump's visit to the Gulf in May, he was convinced by the Gulf leaders and Turkey to adopt a new policy and engage Syria on the highest level. He has met with Syrian President Ahmed al-Shara twice so far, and Shara is also set to meet Trump in the White House on November 10th, which is actually the first such visit by a Syrian president ever to Washington. So all of this goes to show, that there's a historic shift and a strategic recalibration that is happening on the part of both countries. I think US's priorities with regard to Syria are primarily security related, related to the regional security, but also global security after what we saw in Syria with the rise of ISIS or the Islamic State. But the relationship also has an important economic or commercial dimension to it. There are several reasons why Syria is important to Washington. First, I would say that Washington seeks to ensure Syria will stay out of Iran and Russia's sphere of influence and activity in the region. And there is a historic opportunity now for that after the toppling of the Assad regime and the weakening of the Iranian-led regional access. Second, there is the danger of renewed jihadi activity in Syria. The threat doesn't only come from the Islamic State, but also from a host of other groups, such as the Turkestan Islamic Party, which is a Chinese Uyghur group, and various transnational jihadi networks, including Western fighters who are present and active in Syria. So countering or reining in these groups is really critical for the United States and its regional allies as well. Third, Washington has a clear interest in ensuring Syria's post-Assad regime and reality does not evolve into one again, which is overtly hostile toward Israel. We have seen efforts on the part of the U.S. Special Envoy Tom Barrack to narrow the gap between Syria and Israel. There was initially even talks of, reports of Syria joining the Abraham Accords, which doesn't seem to be happening for various understandable reasons at the moment, at least. But Syria is interested in reviving the 1974 disengagement agreement with Israel. It's not still certain that that will happen, but there are and there have been talks to that end. Fourth and equally important and pressing, I would say, is the minority question, the future and fate of the Druze, Alawite, and Kurdish communities in Syria, who altogether make up roughly about 30% of the Syrian population. This is not just a domestic or a moral issue. It carries very serious geopolitical implications involving Israel, Turkey, and Iran, and has been consuming a considerable chunk of U.S. Diplomatic attention and energy in Syria. And following the recent massacres of the Alawites in the coastal region and of the Druze in the south by government and government-allied forces, and Damascus's ongoing tensions with the Kurds, Syria now really faces a very profound domestic crisis that could derail whatever progress has been made inside the country. Zooming out also, we have to understand why Syria, matters not only for its own future, but also for shaping a post-Iranian, post-Russia regional order at a moment of major regional restructuring and realignment. If the U.S. can help align the interests of regional partners, especially the Gulf states, Turkey and Israel, around a coherent framework and a shared vision for Syria and over Syria, it could help lay the foundations of a U.S.-friendly regional order shaped by security and economic cooperation. However, if these actors fail, if these efforts fail to reconcile, the competing agendas surrounding Syria, Syria could once again really become the fault line that fractures regional geopolitics and opens up space for renewed influence by, all sorts of actors, from Russia to Iran, and a resurgence of jihadi activism and insurgency, all of which, Washington and many of the countries in the region do not want to see again. Thank you, and I'll be happy to discuss the details of this further.
Thanks so much, Mohammed. I think, if anything, the revolution in Syria has broke consensuses about regional politics, both on the ground in the region and farther afield. Stephen, turning to the issue now that's been at the center of regional geopolitics, or regional politics and geopolitics regarding the region for more than 2 years now, we have a tenuous ceasefire in Gaza. Lots of grand plans for reconstruction, some of which kind of seem inevitable, some of which seem like AI hallucinations. How do you gauge the administration's role in maintaining the ceasefire and their seriousness about paving a way towards peace and reconstruction?
Well, thanks very much, James. And it's a great pleasure to be a part of this panel. And thanks to Charlie at RSAA. It's a little hard to say, for the invitation. I drew the short straw, so I have to talk about U.S. policy in Gaza. I much would have preferred to talk about Syria, but Mohammed's the expert there, so I have to talk about Gaza. No, in all seriousness, it's my real pleasure. I want to step back from Gaza just a moment and talk about this president and his approach. He has run in his 3 runs for the White House. He made it clear to the American people that he saw one of the primary things that ails the United States was American entanglement in the Middle East. If you go back to his announcement for his first run at the White House, the famous escalator speech from June 2015, which everybody remembers for him talking about they're sending us Mexicans and they're rapists and they're drug dealers and so on and so forth. And those were the sort of racist tropes that framed the rest of the campaign and the president's first term, and even, well, now his second term. But if you read that speech, which I've read a number of times, and watch the video of it, this was a speech about foreign policy and mostly about the Middle East. Mostly about the Middle East. Subsequent to his being elected, the president talked about how the United States had spent $7 trillion on the Middle East, in which he could have rebuilt the United States 3 times. Now, we did not spend $7 trillion on the Middle East prior to him becoming president in 2017, but nevertheless, the point was well taken. And in fact, it was a point that was made by his predecessor, Barack Obama, which was that the American overambition in the Middle East had sapped American power. And here we are now on November 7th, 2025, 10 years, a little more than 10 years after the president first ran for office, on, in part, disentangling the United States from the Middle East. He is now further entangling the United States in perhaps the worst problem, the most unresolvable problem in the Middle East. It is an absolutely stunning turnaround and should be a rebuke to anybody who believes that the president has a worldview that can be categorized intellectually along any spectrum anywhere. Clearly, the president of the United States is reactive, and his famous gut is what tells him what to do. Whereas he understood that politically, to tell the American people he was going to disentangle the United States from the Middle East was a winning political strategy. In practice, he has come in and out and in and out of the Middle East. And he is now as deep into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as any of his predecessors have ever been. Deeper than Barack Obama, deeper than George W. Bush, as deep, if not deeper, as Bill Clinton. I think the president believes that, however, that his 20-point peace plan, which he has said is more than just a ceasefire plan for the Gaza Strip will in turn bring peace and bring the conflict to an end. That will in turn allow the United States to disentangle itself from the Middle East. I think there are a lot of interns that are working really, really hard in the thinking, if that is in fact what the thinking is over at the White House. And I suspect that what we see in Gaza of American foreign policy is a sort of institutionalization of this 20-point plan around which American policy will revolve, in which policymakers will point to. But if we implement more than 1 plus 1/2 of a second point in the list of 20 points, it will be an achievement to which the president will then he'll point to this achievement, which he already has. He will ignore the fact that Hamas is already in violation of the ceasefire and that the Israelis are looking for ways themselves to wiggle out of the ceasefire. And without another quick win or so, former British Prime Minister Tony Blair will be left holding the bag that is the Gaza Strip and the 20-point peace plan, with no top cover, no political cover from the President of the United States, forced to wrangle Israelis, Palestinians, Turks, Qataris, Egyptians, Saudis, and Emiratis. Although Saudis and Emiratis already see what's coming and seem to be stepping back because the plan is not being fulfilled in the way in which they believe it should be fulfilled. Hamas having no role, Hamas being disarmed, whilst the other major countries are sort of wordsmithing and litigating the 20-point peace plan, which is something that the United States will overlook and now defend the 20-point peace plan regardless, which puts the Israeli government in a real bind because we're heading towards elections in Israel and Netanyahu needs to run on something. And the fact that the United States is now defending a 20-point peace plan, even though Hamas is in violation of it, leaves the Israelis in the very uncomfortable position of wanting themselves to break the 20-point peace plan to fulfill their strategic goals, but unable to do so because its strategic ally, its only ally, remains committed to it. This will require presidential attention, but we've already seen the president has moved on. The issue of the day is internationally is Venezuela. Looks like we're pivoting back towards Russia. There'll be a brief interlude in which Ahmed al-Shara will come to the White House. As Mohammed pointed out, the first time ever a Syrian president was there. The president will advocate for the lifting of the Syrian Civilian Protection Act. He'll say nice things about Ahmed al-Shara. Ahmed al-Shara will say that Syria is joining the anti-ISIS coalition. It'll be really nice. And then we'll be on to something else. But Gaza will continue to fade into the background. In the meantime, the Israelis will fortify the yellow line in the Gaza Strip, dividing the Gaza Strip. 200,000 Palestinians are on their side of the yellow line. The rest are on the Hamas side of the yellow line. And we will be stuck negotiating how to implement points 18 through 20, which will never be implemented. And the outcome of this will be the president essentially washing his hands of the Gaza situation, dumping it, as I said, on Tony Blair, while his son-in-law builds a couple of buildings on the Israeli side of the Green Line. And what we will have is essentially a new status quo in the Gaza Strip that is not any step towards either the implementation of the 20-point plan and a situation that is a good deal worse for Palestinians. So the mess will remain, and all of the enthusiasm, at least that the president exuded in the Knesset and in Egypt, will be quickly a thing of the past. I suspect, James, that if we come back on November 7th, 2026, not long after the U.S. midterm elections, we will essentially be in the same place in Gaza, though I'm sure there will be flare-ups of violence and further deterioration of the ceasefire. With that, I wish that I could be more positive, but I'm always as we say here, the skunk at the party when I talk about Israel and the Palestinians. I look forward to the conversation after Sanam's, I'm sure, a very, very interesting presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. And for sure, I think there's also, I think it needs to be said, a risk in the issue of Gaza falling into the background, because if probably chiefly among the reasons why October 7th happened in the first place was a strategic calculation by Hamas that the issue had fallen too far into the background and needed to be more at the center. So I think there's risks associated there that could, being in the same place a year from now might be not the worst outcome.
Although I will say that the Israelis have learned their lesson from that, not that they should move forward towards a political solution to this problem, but that they will continue to keep the military pressure up on Hamas if they aren't disarmed and not part of any governance formula in Gaza, which seems quite unlikely.
Right. Sanam, I turning to you on Iran. The Trump administration, seemed to make Iran hawks' dreams come true back in June and July, as the U.S. bombed Iran's nuclear facilities following 2 weeks of missile exchanges between Iran and Israel. Since then, things have seemed quiet, but in conversations I've had with Iran experts, they tell me that quiet could be misleading. And so what do you think is going on now, 4 months after, those dramatic bombing runs in Tehran and elsewhere?
Great to be with you. Thanks to the RSAA for having me, and always good to listen to Mohammed and Stephen. I will try to inject my own dose of realism. Can't promise a positive story either. But US policy on Iran in the second Trump administration very much, despite the 12-day war over the summer, continues to echo some of the same themes that we have seen from the president in his first term as well. He has continued to rely on maximum pressure. In fact, the government, what remains of the U.S. government right now, does continue to work on under the auspices of the National Security Presidential Memorandum 2 to reduce Iranian oil as low as it can go, impose more sanctions on Iran in order to contain, if not alter, Iran's behavior in the region. But of course, the environment has changed, and the 12-day war has had a monumental impact. But I think, and I'll speak to that in a second, but I do think still the president very much vacillates between his competing impulses of coercion against the Islamic Republic, containment of the Islamic Republic, which has been a longstanding Iranian policy, U.S. policy towards Iran for 47 years now, or deal making with the Islamic Republic that, is always out there as one of the far-fetched but, potential scenarios that actually many in the region are hoping for. And I think a third facet of the relationship or non-relationship between the U.S. and Iran is also connected to Trump's strengthened Gulf partnerships, his need for burden sharing, and where he sees the Gulf states, particularly the UAE, Saudi, and Qatar, playing an important role in managing, containing, bridge building, mediating, facilitating, building any kind of off-ramp on the Iran issue. So let me just dig into some of these points. Obviously, the 12-day war over the summer was a real shift in the president's posture towards Iran. I personally think that this president has continued to sort of shock and awe on Iran in a way that no U.S. president has done, and over 4 decades. Obviously, he broke taboos and red lines in joining the Israeli strikes. and really showcase the US's ability to damage, if not fully dismantle Iran's enrichment capabilities. What's really interesting as an outcome of the 12-day war, there are a few interesting bits, but what's interesting to me is obviously that immediately after the bombing of Fordow, the US declared job done and quickly retreated back to declaring, imposing a ceasefire on Israel and Iran. Since the war has been concluded, he has stuck to this idea that Iran's nuclear program has been damaged, enrichment is no longer an issue, and interestingly, so have the Iranians. They're also playing into that same line. No one is touching Fordow. No one's moving anything around. There's no real clarity on the 400 kilograms of enriched uranium. So in a way, there's a bit of a stalemate that could result in further tensions or could result in potential negotiations, or we could stay in this status quo period where nothing happens, nothing changes, Iran is contained. But that is always, I think, what the quote unquote Iran experts that you were referring to, might be worried about, that doing nothing and leaving it to fester is potentially always dangerous. And I certainly subscribe to that view as well. Okay, so the nuclear program perhaps is contained. What are the other takeaways? The US, of course, crossed these thresholds vis-a-vis Iran, and for the Islamic Republic, there were a number of outcomes, that are worthwhile mentioning. First of all, the war didn't result in the dramatic downfall of the Islamic Republic that many people, let's say journalists, were speculating about, and many activists were hoping for. In fact, for the regime itself, it pulled itself together and proved to be resilient in response to, humiliating breaches of its intelligence. To me, it's no surprise that Israel had the quantitative military edge. I mean, I would have been worried if it didn't. So that's not my takeaway from the war, but the fact that the Iranians recapitalized, and that's how they see their ability to recapitalize as being important, because this is a system that has different takeaways from their dramatic encounters in conflict. It's worthwhile remembering that during the Iran-Iraq War, their ability to survive again, in spite of encirclement over an 8-year period, was their principal takeaway. So understanding their worldview, I think, is important. Nevertheless, Iran, didn't seek to expand the theater of the war. It was a bilateral war between Iran and Israel. And I think that Iran was very careful and tactical. This is not a narrative that plays out in Israel, certainly, and definitely not in Washington. But again, the Iranians were quite directed in how they responded to Israeli attacks. A hit on Pars resulted in a hit on Haifa. There was a much more tit for tat messaging taking place. And the fact that the Iranians were looking to prevent a US entry into the war, which, they didn't succeed, but they were also looking to contain the war, I think is important. And that is connected to the role of the Gulf here. The Gulf Iranian normalization has been underway for quite some time. Certainly, by no means have things been sorted and resolved. There, remain clear friction points and tensions still across the region, despite Israel's battering of the axis of resistance. But nevertheless, this normalization is one that Iran is looking to continue, is looking to capitalize on, and sees diplomatic ties with the Gulf states as useful for a variety of reasons. Indeed, while Iran was negotiating with the United States in advance of the 12-day war, the Gulf states were kept in the loop. Iranian officials repeatedly went around the Gulf to, secure their buy-in, for example. So, going forward, I think, and this is something that perhaps both the Iranians and the Trump administration have in common, I think the Gulf states will continue to be important players in managing, containing, and bridge building. And that, of course, is part of the U.S. administration's aim of burden sharing and, asking American partners and allies, particularly the Trump whispers in the Gulf, to do more. So that is certainly important. Obviously, looking more broadly, I think for the president, the Iran problem set perhaps is less acute. The regional dynamics have resulted in shifts for Iran, weaknesses for Iran. Iran, interestingly, doesn't see the axis of resistance as completely burned, but one that can, over time, again, depending on the vacuums of power that develop and the changing regional landscape, that it can try to reconstitute. So, that still is prevalent in the Iranian mindset. But Iran is equally looking to capitalize on changing threat perceptions in the Middle East that are worthwhile, highlighting. Obviously, traditionally, Iran has been the biggest regional menace, destabilizing influence in the Middle East, and there is a sort of perception now over the past 2 years with Gaza, but also Syria, Lebanon, and of course the war against Iran, that Israel actually has revisionist aims and is destabilizing. And for the Gulf, this is a new variable that they don't quite know how to manage. And of course, Gulf leaders who do have the presidency here, and Mohammed bin Salman is coming to Washington on November 18th, will be trying to use their leverage in order to try to impress upon the president to, continue to take advantage of shifts in Syria, support, better governance in Lebanon. It's unclear to me what demilitarization of Hezbollah looks like. And I'm just back from Beirut, but, more broadly, also Gulf states are seeking some kind of diplomatic track with Iran because they see leaving the Iranian problem set to the side as a dangerous one, in the same way that they remain very committed to the Palestinian track, even if I do share Stephen's skepticism of the president's ability to mobilize and maintain attention. So, all of this has to be put into the broader context of the U.S. Administration's bandwidth, government shutdowns, capacity, and willing to engage in new negotiations with Iran that remain out there. On October 10th, President Trump yet again dangled the prospect of negotiations with Iran, invited Iran to Sharm el-Sheikh, and the Iranians have tacitly sort of supported the ceasefire at the same time. But Iran's supreme leader has no intention of supporting talks, while the U.S. position on negotiations is really unclear. And that's what's the biggest problem right now. It's almost like we're back to ground zero, whether that's 2003, when, news of Iran's clandestine nuclear program emerged, or you can pick other points in history, 2013. We really just don't have a good sense of what the U.S. is looking to achieve vis-a-vis Iran, and what all of the other parties in the region would accept simultaneously. And the Iranians themselves, clearly don't trust President Trump after the 12-day war. So we're in a bit of a stalemate, and we'll have to see how things evolve.
Thanks so much, Sanam. Returning now to sort of our open conversational Q&A period of the session, and I just want to encourage folks to pop questions into the Q&A box or chat or whatever you have at your disposal on Zoom, and they'll find their way to me, and I'll try and ask them. And I've received maybe one or two so far. I think, in a way, what we might want to talk about here, sort of zooming a little bit farther in from Washington. I think, if we're going to understand challenges that might emerge over the next year or two in the region, it really comes down to what exactly is the shape of this regional realignment that's happening right now, right? As a result of the collapse of the Assad government. I mean, both Mohammed and Stephen mentioned that, it's shocking that this is the first president of Syria that's ever going to get a chance to come to the White House. What's, I think, even more shocking is that this is a president who's a former member of Al Qaeda and Jabhat al-Nusra, like going back 10 or 15 years. This is like an unthinkable thing from an ideological perspective. And so, I think it's important to sort of pick at that maybe a little bit and understand, at least on the Syrian front, what are, like, how have politics changed, on the ground and regionally, how have attitudes towards Syrian governance and also towards the minority issue from the perspective of Syria, or from the perspective of, say, Turkey or Iran or Israel, changed in the last year, and what kind of challenges might emerge from that fact? Sanam, you mentioned the sort of battering that the axis of resistance had taken over the last year. I think this is critically important, and doesn't necessarily mean we should ignore what's happening in Yemen. We shouldn't ignore the role of Hezbollah, which is, I mean, southern Lebanon has been battered by Israeli airstrikes in the last couple of days. And take seriously the perception of Israeli revisionism across the region. And I think, Stephen, too, I mean, understanding how this even, I mean, I think complicates the Gaza issue. It's not just, what's possible on the ground in Gaza, but how is the behavior of Israel towards the rest of the region going to make anything possible, going forward. So, I mean, maybe as a sort of broader question, to each of you, like, how do you understand regional realignment, sort of absent strong intervention from Trump, on each of these issues? Maybe we can start with Sanam and go backwards through the group, and then I have a couple questions coming in from the chat from there.
Sure, thank you. I mean, I think you're quite right. The regional dynamics are very important, and thank you for bringing up Yemen. I neglected to mention it, and it's another one of these festering conflicts. And I mean, I was just reading the other day that the idea is to snap back to the status quo ante of October 6, 2023, and restart the roadmap as if the past 2 years hasn't happened. So I find that very troubling. Frankly speaking, I think this is a year of opportunity and challenge in the Middle East. And unfortunately, I veer to the fact that it's going to be very hard for regional states to invest in the opportunities that are ahead of them. But if you're just thinking about Lebanon and Hezbollah, for example, certainly battered. And there is an opportunity with this technocratic government to put pressure on Hezbollah, but obviously pressure on its own and military strikes on their own aren't going to be the condition for Hezbollah to demilitarize. There have to be incentives. People have to think outside the box, whether it's inclusivity, reaching out to the very marginalized and abandoned, supporters of Hezbollah, to bring them in, to create a sort of different narrative. And frankly, that's not really what's happening on the ground. It's a circular conversation of economic incentives in exchange for demilitarization, and that isn't going to create or build on the opportunity that's ahead of us. And I think, it's worthwhile noting that 2 years on from Israel's war in Gaza, Hamas is still there. It still has the relative monopoly of force on the ground, and that, promotes this other governance challenge in the region. And ultimately, in all of these states, governance is the key issue at the heart of these conflicts. And so without more investment from regional states that don't really have the capacity, and when I'm talking about investment, I'm not just talking about financial investment. Too often in the West, there is the assumption, and in Israel actually, that, oh yeah, the Gulf states are just going to pay for everything. And they're very much pushing back on this narrative that they are the regional ATM. And they don't want to invest in conflicts that are not stabilized, that there are not sort of guarantees that, the Israelis are going to continue to blow things up and they have to just pay to have it fixed. So the dynamics are incredibly fragile, but also very much connected. I think there is an opportunity here, but, taking all of these these governance challenges in silos isn't necessarily the right approach. You do have to bring in engagement within these societies and think outside of the box. Otherwise, we will just be in this circular crisis of conflict, which, is dangerous, as we've seen for the past 2 years.
Yeah, getting off the hamster wheel is really, in a way, the main challenge. Stephen?
Yeah, I have a somewhat different perspective. I'm not quite sure what regional realignment we're talking about here. I think James, your question and Sanam's presentation, the regional realignment is one that is drifting towards Iran and an alignment with the Iranians. And that seems to me quite unlikely. And I would say that the big moments of the last 2 years that have led people to think about regional realignment are the end of the Assad regime in Syria and the vast weakening of Hezbollah and the killing of Hassan Nasrallah. Those things were made possible by Israeli arms. And so the opportunities that presented to Lebanese and Syrians were a function of the Israelis doing what they said that they would do on October 8th, 2023, which was change the region so that they didn't have to live under the threat of Hezbollah or Hamas or so on and so forth. While I certainly think that the Gulf states have believed that the Israelis, no, I should put it this way. The Gulf states were surprised that it took the Israelis so long to do so much damage to Hamas. They were actually quite pleased about the damage done to Iran. Private conversations with Gulf leaders would suggest that this was the Israel that they were lining up with. Now, when it comes to Gaza, they certainly don't want to be the ATMs. But the reason why the Saudis and the Emiratis are backing away is because they don't see the actual disarmament of Hamas. They don't see Hamas being isolated. The narrative about the Gulf states seeing Israel as an aggressor in the region is essentially an Iranian and Qatari narrative that has been accepted, I think, by various and sundry governments and others, but without a lot of real emphasis to it. I don't think, without a lot of real evidence of this, I think that the relationship between the Emiratis and the Israelis and the Saudis and the Israelis remain important to everybody there. But in terms of a regional realignment in which there is a shift towards Tehran seems to me extremely unlikely. That's not to suggest that the Saudis and the Emiratis haven't remained committed to their normalization with the Iranians, but the trust factor among those three countries very, very significantly low. So that I think that if we're talking about a regional realignment, it's a function of the changes in Lebanon and Syria. And the question is whether those will be converted into actual changes, or the lack of American attention to them will leave it to a point where it allows the Iranians to rebuild Hezbollah. They've funneled $1 billion to Hezbollah over the course of the last year. Another reason why the Saudis absolutely refuse to invest a single dime in Lebanon, and whether we can convert Ahmed al-Shara, a jihadist, a leader of a transnational jihadist movement, into an actual statesman. Now, that was something that the president is likely to try to do on Monday and then leave it to the Saudis and others in the region to finish. I think the region is very much up for grabs, but it's not, I don't think that it is really a function of people shifting in the Iranian camp. It's a question of, can the changes that have occurred over the last 2 years be converted into something beyond this medium range? There are changes, and hopefully President Aoun will be able to negotiate with Hezbollah, blah, 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 blah. The same kind of thing with Syria.
Yeah, I take that point. Although I think, as much of a
counter narrative,
yeah.
A counter narrative to like a kind of conventional wisdom that has taken hold in various precincts, I'm sure Merip and other places. But it strikes me that it strikes me that the idea of a shift towards Iran is kind of overblown.
Yeah, no, I mean, I take that point well, and but I think it's worth remembering the events that immediately preceded the ceasefire agreement, which was an Israeli strike on Doha, and
100%.
yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah, I think
And in fact, the countries were so scared by that event that the president used it as a means to force a ceasefire. The Israelis were so chagrined by a miscalculation and under criticism from the Trump administration, and the countries are so scared as a result, the president saw this as an opportunity.
Can I just jump in really quickly? Because I think there is a bit of nuance here. The reality is that the region, be it Turkey all the way down to Egypt, all the way into the Gulf, is very much caught between two big countries beginning with the letter I. And whether it's quiet conversations you have anywhere in the world, but certainly sitting in London and spending quite a bit of time in the region, their conventional wisdom is that they are caught between an expansionist Iran that has for the time being deterred, but a revisionist Israel as well. So it's not a realignment into one camp or another. And what's problematic is the zero-sum takeaways of the past 2 years. Israel has certainly demonstrated its military capabilities, presented opportunities for the Gulf states, and maybe local actors across the region to assert some agency here. But there isn't a mad rush of embrace of Israel. Actually, the Gulf leaders, and I don't think it's a Qatari or Iranian narrative, Stephen, are very worried that at the end of this period of pronounced war in the region, and you can sort of see Israel's activities striking the Damascus defense ministry and beyond, that they will continue to be at the end of Israel's military pressure. And that's something that they do articulate and are concerned about privately, but now actually openly. And that's something that the US president is hearing from them.
Yeah, I want to, if I can, Stephen, I want to go to Mohammed just to make sure we address this realignment question in regards to Syria too, because I think as I again take your point again, what's happening in Syria is one of the dominoes in the chain here. Mohammed, I think also something we haven't really talked about in this conversation, in regards to regional realignment or perceptions of Iran or Israel or the United States, et cetera, is like popular politics and probably how actually people feel and popular movements feel on the ground about these issues, regardless of what their leaders are deciding to do or the problems that their leaders face in terms of geopolitics. This strikes me as probably more important in Syria than anywhere else, because it's so fragile, right? Because like the parties at play stand at the head of mass movements of some sort or another, be they Kurdish, Islamist, so on and so forth. So, I mean, how do you think this conversation is being read on the ground in Syria, maybe sort of at the meso or popular level, by the different parties there, and what might that mean, in terms of where Shara heads next after the White House?
That's a great question. I think it's, the fact on the ground is that we have different attitudes and understandings on the, at the popular level in terms of what is going on. On the one hand, if you're looking, for example, at the question of extending or expanding the Abraham Accords and making peace with Israel, that is definitely something which is very unpopular in Syria with, many segments of the Syrian society, especially among the Sunni Arab majority, which also, happens to be the main constituency of the government currently in power in Damascus. But there is definitely, even on the part of, Sunni Arabs in Syria and the broader Syrian population, in this case, for example, a willingness to reset relations with the West and with the United States in particular. On the other hand, if you look, at the case of the minorities and their attitudes, you will see, that they might be actually more open and receptive to the idea of, engaging with Israel and establishing some sort of relationship between Syria and Israel, because they would see that as a way of having a neighboring country that that happens to have converging or similar views in terms of the future trajectory of the Syrian state and the fate of the minority there. So, we do not have really sort of a unified or monolithic understanding or set of attitudes in the country toward that issue. If I can also, comment very briefly on the broader question of regional alignment, I think, what we are having at the moment is really, a post-Iranian moment in the region, in particular, since the Israeli attacks on Hezbollah, the weakening of Hezbollah, and the removal of the Assad regime. But, this situation has been really evolving pretty quickly. And what we are seeing at the moment is, that the kind of circumstances or the foundation for some sort of broader realignment between major U.S. partners, be that Israel, the Gulf states, even though they are not also monolithic on this question, and Turkey. The opportunity for that is kind of really fading away because of what is happening in Syria and the diverging visions and agendas that each of these countries have. So all of this really makes the U.S. role here very critical. Without an outside broker, which is acceptable to all these major regional actors, it would be very difficult to really speak of any sort of realignment, because the internal differences and antagonisms and struggles between each of these actors or among these actors are very serious, and in and of themselves and on their own, they do not really have the capability of, agreeing on the future trajectory of the region. So the U.S. role is very critical, but for obvious reasons, and the fact that the U.S. is now at the global level mostly focused on competing with China, it cannot really dedicate sustained, attention and a broad bandwidth to the Middle East, which can be detrimental to the future of the changes and shifts that we are seeing in the region.
Thanks, Mohammed. We have a few minutes left, so I want to make sure I address a couple other audience questions that have come my way, if that's all right. I have a question that's come from an audience member about, putting the U.S. aside for a second, other regional or global, actors that are changing the region or having influence here, and what their state is. I mean, the question specifically name checks China, Turkey, and India, but we might also, I think, maybe throw Russia into this. I mean, Mohammed, I was reading the last few days that maybe starting to come back to Hmeim, the air base that they operated on the Mediterranean, Syria. I'll throw this out to anyone who wants to take it, but how do we assess the role of non-U.S. regional and global powers and their influence in this particular moment? Maybe we start with Stephen?
Sure, I'm happy to start with it. First, I was in Damascus 10 days ago, and the outreach to the Russians was basically in exchange for Assad, there would be a consideration for the Russians in Syria. It doesn't seem to me that President Putin bought that exchange. And so I think at least at the moment, it doesn't seem likely that the Russians are coming back. But it does suggest that the Syrians are as hostile as they are to the Russians and the Iranians more so. It seems like they are more willing to deal with the Russians than some might have suspected at the outset of regime change. It strikes me when it comes to Turkey, a country that I spend a lot of time working on, that the Turks want to play a role shaping the region, yet they're thwarted by their adoption of a worldview that is hostile to other major powers in the region. The Israelis are deeply, deeply skeptical of the exercise of Turkish power in the Gaza Strip. Ironically, it's U.S. officials who are suggesting that Turkey be involved there because there's a belief that Hamas will listen to Turkey. But what is it exactly that Turkey is telling Hamas, given the fact that Turkey has allowed Hamas to use its financial system and its territory to run operations against Israel? So that's one problem with Turkey playing the role that it would like to play. The other problem is that Turkey would like to be the benefactor, the external patron of Ahmed al-Shara in Damascus. And it strikes me that the Saudis are not really ready to concede the point to the Turks. There's actually a rather significant Saudi presence in Damascus right now, and a considerable interest in a soft landing there that does not necessarily proclaim Turkey as the outside patron of Syria. And that leaves us to the Chinese, who really aren't that interested. I mean, I think the secret of the Chinese success in the region is to learn the lessons of the United States getting wrapped around the axle in engineering the politics of the region. And the good news for the Chinese is nobody gets out of bed in the morning in the Middle East and looks towards Beijing. They all look towards the United States to be that player, the external actor that's going to get people to focus on the problems and so on and so forth. I think, though, you have a somewhat different actor in the White House. If you go back to President Trump's tweet when he was, or truth out, or whatever you call it, not long after he was elected and Assad had fallen, he said, "This is not our fight." And I think what he would like to do is to see to it that the Congress lifts the Caesar Act, and then would like regional powers like the Saudis and others to work out Syria within the region without a robust American effort to convert the change in Syria from December 2024 into a kind of permanent change and bring along the new Syrian government. He'd like Saudis and others to do that, and that's not necessarily a role of the United States. So again, there is this idea that you hear from officials in the region about agency, which is undermined by their desire for the United States to step in and do stuff. But now they're confronted with someone else who's like, you guys do it. I think that's going to be the push me pull you between the United States and the region on a problem like Syria.
Yeah, I don't know if Sanam or Mohammed have a response to this question on China, but I might have one more that I might throw out there before if we have a couple of minutes, Charlie. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I'll give you an opportunity to answer that, or one other point. I think it's important to mention, if we're talking about U.S. policy in the region and having a panel on this, that so much of our conversation is focused on diplomacy, geopolitics, regional politics, and we haven't really addressed another major pillar of U.S. policy in the region, which has been humanitarian aid. The collapse of USAID over the last few months is something that I think has gone probably very under recognized in the region. It's certainly impacted Yemen tremendously. I mean, what we're seeing there is the potential for famine, almost on the level that we've seen in Sudan and Gaza over the last few months, and as a direct result of the collapse of international aid through USAID. So I might kind of throw out that question too, sort of taking the sort of regional realignment, diplomatic, realist type questions out of the picture for a second. Like, what is the impact of humanitarian aid, evaporating in so many places from where you sit? Might go to Mohammed and then Sanam. Either of those questions on other regional actors or humanitarian aid?
I think on the humanitarian aid question, it's really going or has been actually quite detrimental because of the conditions that we have had over the past several decades in the region, conflict and poverty in many parts of the region. Various communities have come to really rely on these foreign aid programs, and so with the USAID as being, one of the major sort of providers of that kind of assistance being out of the picture, the consequences have been and can be even more serious, especially in the case of a country, like Syria and Syrian refugee and IDP populations within the country and outside the country. I also want to very briefly comment on the China and Russia question. I think China has an interest in the region for sure, but that interest is being at the moment mainly pursued through economic statecraft and the Chinese geoeconomic approach, and it doesn't it hasn't for sure amounted to any sort of serious political or military engagement, even though in the case of the Iranian-Saudi deal that we saw a couple of years ago, China, certainly wanted to flex some muscle and show to everyone else, that they have the ability to pull off some major, diplomatic agreements and deals that others, including the U.S. and the West, were not capable of achieving. But I think there is a greater room for Russia here. Yes, Syrians have been by and large alienated from Russia because of Moscow siding with the Assad regime and the atrocities that it committed in support of Assad. But the behavior of the new state of Syria, as in the case of the previous regimes in that country, is really constrained and shaped by a sense of geopolitical determinism. And that is mostly the Syrian relationship with Israel and the fact that Syria cannot just choose to be a rich country where everybody, is going to invest, but it has to, or at least the way it understands Israel is that it has to be a powerful country in military terms. And it doesn't seem very likely, that the West is going to support Syria toward that end. Turkey has some capabilities, but it is limited, and Israel is also very, strongly opposed to that. So the only actor there that has some, sort of chance to actually step in and to be able to assist Syria in this task would be Russia. It won't be easy if Russia moves in the direction of military and security cooperation with Syria moves in the direction of military and security cooperation with Russia. It would have very serious consequences in terms of its relationship with the West or even its regional partners in the Gulf and in Turkey.
Great. And Sanam, just give you a chance to talk, either humanitarian aid or the China, Russia, Turkey question.
Sure. I won't belabor the China question because I agree with the analysis, but worthwhile, of course, just quickly mentioning that obviously the Gulf economies still remain primarily anchored towards China. So managing geopolitical tensions and preventing sort of have this conventional saying of having to pick sides continues to be an orientation for the Gulf. But on the US aid, I think you're quite right to raise it, and it's very important. It's got devastating consequences that I think, again, attempts to pass the burden on to American partners and allies in the region who themselves are strained, but are going to have to be left to manage crises that are, man-made famines that have, deep impact on economies. And climate, above all, is a hard security issue across the region and will put pressure loop back on Europe and the UK and, the West again in terms of migration. So the consequences will be borne out, not just immediately, but over a generation and, can continue this conflict loop. So just another negative to throw out there.
Yeah, I would that we had time to talk about climate issues, I think that's, one thing that's just on the horizon here for a lot of the problems we've been discussing today. Charlie, am I right that we're at time?
Yes.
Awesome. Well, I just want to thank Mohammed, Stephen, Sanam for a really engaging and fascinating discussion. I had a lot of fun with it, even though we're all kind of skunks at our own party here, as Stephen put it. But yeah, I just want to thank everybody for joining us, and for Charlie for helping set all this up. It was great to be back in conversation with all of you.